Buenas tardes. How's everybody doing today? Sorry I wasn't able to go live last week. I got COVID really bad and I was sick, but I'm feeling a little bit better now. Unfortunately, it's the end of my spring break and we go back to school tomorrow. And today we're going to be talking about the importance of repetition in comprehensible input. So thank you for watching. My name is Scott Benedict, and this is Immediate Immersion Live, where we're all about comprehension-based instruction in the modern language classroom. We'll be right back after this short intro. And welcome back. Let's go ahead and get started here. And I gotta fix one little thing here. Bear with me 1 second. There we go. So we're going to talk about repetition today, why it's important, how we used to do it, questioning, details, and layering. So let's start with talking about why it's important. We all know that we learn our language from repetition. When we are babies and our parents are teaching us our first language, they're using a lot of repetition. They're keeping it simple and they're talking about things that are right around our world. And through lots and lots of repetition, we get vocabulary, we get sentence syntax, we get how to pronounce the words. All of those things are important. And kids even realize how important repetition is. They have their favorite books that they like you to read over and over and over and over again. That's because it's familiar and they need the repetition to be able to learn the language, learn to read, learn to spell, learn to pronounce, increase their vocabulary. So they will often ask for you to read the same book over and over and over again, and they may never tire of it. So we need these repetitions over and over to be able to get vocabulary and language patterns stuck in our heads. Simple things that can relate easily to the way we do it in our native language may need only 50 to 100 or so repetitions for it to get stuck in our brains. But the more complex, the more different it is from your first language, the more repetitions are going to need. One of my students is on and he's saying it's his birthday. Happy birthday. So what the number of repetitions is not an exact science. We just need enough repetitions until it gets stuck in our heads, and that can vary from student to student, from person to person, from language to language, from vocabulary item to vocabulary item. But what we do know is that we need repetition in order for us to acquire language. We cannot just hear it or see it once and then it works and it's stuck in our brains forever. It's just not how language and way our brains work. Let's talk about how we used to do it. When I started teaching with comprehensible input way back when, we used to tell our stories 3 times. We wouldn't change them in between. We would just tell the story once, and then we would ask questions about it. Then we would go and tell the story again and ask a couple more questions about it, and then ask the story again. So that kids would hear the three versions of the same story with little variation. And kids tended to tune out of that part because It was boring. They already heard it. We knew they needed repetition, but we just hadn't figured out the best way to provide that repetition so kids would still be focused on understanding the message. And so that's where questioning came in. And we started what they called circling questions. I don't like that term because it doesn't really say what it is. I understand why they came up with that term, because the word that you're trying to teach or the grammatical structure that you're trying to teach, you're asking questions around that. So you're circling that item. But giving it that title when in training sessions, I always had to explain a lot more than I would have to just to get them to understand what that was, because it's really not an easy concept to understand with that title. What I prefer to call them is scaffolded differentiated questions. Why do I like to call them that? Because they're scaffolded in the way that you are leveling your questions. You start off with yes/no questions. You move up to either/or questions. You move on to who, what, when, where questions that can often be answered with only a single word. And then you progress even to more open-ended questions like how and why. So those are scaffolding the questions. You're going from really easy questions to more difficult questions to answer. But they're also differentiated. How are they differentiated? Because you need to ask the right question to the right student at the right time. How do you do that? You need to know the approximate level of your students. So when you're asking them questions, you know which question to ask. You never want to try to embarrass your students. So you want to ask them questions that you're reasonably sure that they're going to be able to answer correctly. So if I know that they're a student who's struggling with the language, I'm going to stick to yes, no, and either/or questions because I'm giving them a choice. But again, I'm choosing questions that I'm reasonably sure that they can answer. If I'm looking at a mid-level student, one who understands but is not at the top of the class, those I'm going to ask my who, what, when, where questions. They often require only one word to answer, but you can also answer with a complete sentence if the kid is up to it. But again, I'm choosing my students to ask those questions based on their level in my class. And then I reserve for my superstar students the how and the why questions, because those generally can't be answered in one word and they need more structure to be able to answer more language. So it's important to do it that way. So that's how my questioning is both scaffolded and differentiated. It's also important to not only ask questions to the class as a whole. That builds confidence for those lower kids, but also to ask individuals. And the key to asking individuals are your lower performing students, the students who are trying, but it's taking them a little bit longer to process the language. And I use them as what we call a barometer student, a student who lets you know how things are going in your class. If you ask a question to a top or a mid student and they get it right, all that means is that everybody at that level or above probably could answer the question. But what about the students below that? I don't know if they understood the question or they could answer it. And we're trying not to leave any students behind. So we want to make sure that we're including all students and making our classes as comprehensible as possible. So I need to know if those lower students understood the question and can answer it. So I pay more attention to the questions I ask my lower students. If they're able to answer the question and they understood the question, then the odds are that everybody above them understood it. So that means I pretty much encompassed my entire class. So we use them as a barometer for that way. Now, when we teach in workshops, we teach the pattern of questioning. We talk about starting off with yes, no, then going to either or, then going to simple question words, and then the how and why. But you never want to ask those questions in that particular order. If you do it enough that way, then what happens is kids can predict the answers regardless of the question, because they know he always starts with a yes-no question. Then he goes with an either-or question. Then he goes with a question word question. Then he asks a how and a why question, and then he repeats the process. So we don't want to have that as a pattern. One of the ways that you can help randomize until you've gotten a skill of being able to do it without thinking, there's two things I like to teach my teachers to do. The first is to put a poster in the back of the room near the ceiling where your eyes are often able to see really quickly when you're teaching in your classroom. And then you put things like plus, negative, or, and then a question mark. Those four symbols will tell you what types of questions. They help remind you what types of questions. And then you just got to remember not to do them in that order, just to randomly do them. Or if you prefer, you could make a little card deck out of cardstock with types of questions on them. Not the actual questions. It's much more natural if you can come up with those questions on the spot. But you can put a card with yes, no, either or. The who, put a one with who, one with what, one with when, one with how, one with why. So you can shuffle the deck and you can go ahead and then answer those questions as you go along. James, one of my students, has asked a question. Any advice on keeping the class compelling when you pace the class to the back of the class, the lower level students? You're always asking a variety of questions. You need to ask questions that engage the lower end of your class as well as the mid and top level. So you're not leaving your top level kids behind. You ask questions to them as well to keep them involved. Plus, you're going to use short, choppy sentences to address your lower level students, mid-type sentences for your mid students, and then more complex sentences for your top students. So you're going to be varying how you ask questions, how you talk to your students, how you tell stories, how you structure your text for them to read in short, medium, and long sentences so that each student is engaged at their level. It's a great question. So you want to randomize those questions so you're not asking them in any particular pattern. You're welcome. In any particular pattern. And those two ways are the ways I found easiest to be able to help randomize until you build that skill of being able to do it to yourself. The deck of cards worked better for me because it just reminded me. I would just shuffle the deck and then, ooh, it says a what question. So I'll ask a what question. And I'll shuffle the deck and it says, ooh, it's a how question. So I'll ask a how question. And then I would know who to ask those questions to. I knew to ask my how and why questions to my top students, my yes or no questions to my lower students, my simple question words to my mid-level students. Now that's just not enough. When you ask a question and then you get the answer, you're getting only one repetition of the vocab word that you're highlighting or the sentence structure that you're highlighting. But if you repeat back the answer, you're now getting 2 for 1. So for every question, you're getting 2 repetitions. So for example, if I ask, does the boy have a dog? And the kids say yes, I go, that's right. The boy has a dog. So now they heard it twice. You don't count repetitions from students. You only count repetitions from you because it's sure that it's the correct language. So that way I got 2 repetitions of how that verb works, how that sentence is put together by repeating back the answer. So you want to get in the habit of every time a student answers that you repeat back the answer. And with a negative answer, you get a 3 for 1 instead of a 2 for 1. And this is how it would go. So I'm now going to ask a question that I want the answer to be no. Does John have a cat? And the kids go, no. And I go, that's right. No, John doesn't have a cat. John has a dog. So they have the first question, 1 repetition. Then they have the repetition of the answer the students gave, no. And then the repetition of the correct answer, yes. So we got 3 repetitions for 1 question. So that helps you not having to always think of new questions. It helps you to work on getting more bang for your buck. And then the next tip I want to give about questions is that you need to ask questions about each part of a sentence. A typical sentence has 3 parts. It has the subject, the verb, and the object or the predicate. So you want to be asking questions about all 3 parts. Again, you want to randomize that. So again, if you're using that deck of cards, you can say, ask a what question about the subject. Ask a who question about the subject. Ask a why question about the verb, etc., to give you some more variations of types of questions to ask. The awkward questions usually are the verb questions. So I start with, if I'm going to ask a verb questions, opposites. So do they drink cereal or do they eat cereal? Do they ride a horse or do they drive a horse? Those kinds of things. But it doesn't matter what the other verb is that you put there, as long as it's grammatically correct. It doesn't have to be logically correct. And it helps kids to learn the verbs and different verbs. You can also vary the tense. Did he have a dog or does he have a dog based on the story? Was the story told in present tense or was it told in past tense? This is how you can, one of the variations of teaching verbs that you can use. So that's how the different types of questions, how you can vary questions, that you want to ask questions about all 3 parts of the sentence. You want to address questions to both the class and individual students and to both lower students, mid students, and high students to keep everybody engaged. Let's next talk about details, because that's the next way that you can get repetitions. You add details. Now you can add details to sentences, as many details as you'd like, but I like to stick to at least 3. Otherwise, it can get maybe too repetitive if not. So if I ask a question, for example, I ask, what kind of car does John want? And a kid gives me something very, very specific, like a 1979 black Camaro. That's too specific. So I need to step it back a little bit so I don't lose out on my repetitions. So I'll go back and go, oh, John wants a black car. And then I'm going to ask all my questions I can about that sentence. Because originally we had a sentence, John wants a car. Now we added a detail, John wants a black car, and I have a new sentence, but the basics are still the same. The verb we're working on is wants. So now I can go ahead and ask my questions about that sentence. And I can get a whole bunch of repetitions, easily 9 or 10 just from that second sentence that we got. Now we add another detail. It's not just a black car, it's a black Camaro. So now I can say, oh, John wants a black Camaro. Again, basics of the sentence is still the same. I will now just ask more questions about that. Who wants the black Camaro? What color Camaro do they want? Do they want a Camaro or a Firebird? You get the idea, asking all these questions about that. Then I can add, the third detail was it was a 1979 one that they wanted. So John wanted a 1979 black Camaro. And then you can start your questioning all over. So once you have your sentence that you're working with, you want to ask leading questions to add details slowly. If a student gives you something very specific like a 1979 black Camaro, then you step it back so you can add each detail one at a time. But if not, if they just say he wanted a Camaro, great, work with that and then ask another follow-up question. What color Camaro did he want? Oh, he wanted a black Camaro. And then you can work that way. Try to get at least 3 details per sentence, because now you're getting easily 40 to 50 repetitions on this one sentence. And each sentence is slightly different, so kids aren't necessarily getting bored with it because we're adding details slowly. And we're just starting to get the repetitions in. The next thing is layering. And I don't have a better word for it than layering, but it's what you see in children's books. So, for example, let's look at the Little Red Hen. The Little Red Hen does the same thing over and over and over again with slightly different results each time. And so this is natural repetition in children's books that help kids learn vocabulary and the patterns of language. So first, the Little Red Hen says, oh, I'm making some bread. Who wants to collect the grain with me? And she goes to the cat. Do you want to collect grain with me? And the cat says, no, I don't want to do it. She goes to the dog. Does the dog do you want to collect grain with me? And the dog says, no. And then she goes to the pig. Do you want to collect grain with me? No, you don't want to collect grain with me either. So we have these repetitive patterns that keep on going. So you want to try to include those in your stories and in your texts as well, so that kids see the familiar patterns and the repetitions. And you can see this in a variety of children's textbooks. The Brown Bear, the Hungry Caterpillar, the Three Little Pigs. All of these books are very repetitive, and they're there for a purpose to teach the vocabulary and the way that the language is structured all in there. And through that repetition, the children learn how the language is put together and vocabulary. So it's really important. Now, to sum everything up, one of the ways that students can help you with this repetition is 2 ways. The first is after class, I like to ask my lower kids how they understood the classroom. Not as a grade or a punishment or put them on the spot, but to ask them, did I repeat enough? Was it too much repetition? Did you understand what was going on? Oftentimes, kids don't even remember that there's repetition. I remember talking to some of my students years ago when I taught this novel called Pobre Anna. I taught it for like 5 or 6 years. I can't teach it anymore. I practically know it by heart. And this is a good way to show how not only layering and repetition works, but also addressing short, medium, and long sentences to students, so you're engaging kids at every level. So it starts off with, there was a girl. Her name was Anna. There was a girl whose name was Anna. Anna lived in Torrance, California. There was a girl named Anna who lived in Torrance, California. So you can see how this is repetition and building. But when I asked my kids if they thought it was repetitive, the top kids said, oh my gosh, it is so repetitive. My mid kids say, yeah, I can sometimes see it. And my low kids said, not repetitive at all. Because they needed that repetition to be able to interpret what's going on. So use those lower students to gauge your repetition, and ask your top students as well to make sure that you're not losing those students from boredom. The next thing I like to do is I can assign randomly some of my kids in class to focus on one word or one grammatical structure that I'm trying to hit that day. And I'll give them a sticky memo, or I have also the little clickers like baseball people use to click how many things are done, or people counting how many people are coming into an amusement park. I have those. So you can do sticky note, or you can do the clickers, whichever works best for you. And then I assign them a word. So maybe that's the word have. Every time you hear the word have, I want you to either click, or I want you to put a hash mark down on the sticky note. It allows that student to focus on the whole class because they're focusing on that one word. So they need to hear the whole class. So that helps them focus. So it's really great for kids who have trouble focusing in class. But it also is a teaching aid for me, because at the end of class, I'll collect these and go, ooh, I didn't hit this as much as I wanted to. Or, oh my gosh, I went way overboard with this one, but neglected this one. And it doesn't have to be 100% accurate. You're just getting a gauge for how things are going in your class and which structures you need to work on more and which ones you may have worked on to death, and you can move on from that. So those are all of my things about using repetition in the classroom and why it's important to be able to use repetition in the classroom, and how you can do so without boring all of your students all of the time. A lot of times teachers will say, oh yeah, I do this and my kids get really bored. It usually is because you're not varying your questions, and you're not adding details, and you may not be layering at all. So you want to experiment with these. Don't try to do all of them at once if you're newbie. Just start off with one skill, work that skill till you've got it mastered, and then add on the next skill to it. So if you found this helpful in any way, I would greatly appreciate if you would like and subscribe. That helps these videos get out to more teachers and help them. Remember, I'm here every week on Mondays at 5 p.m. Pacific. Next week, we're going to be talking about technology in the classroom. And I also wanted to share with you, if you are interested in taking our free masterclass, you can go to mm.us/masterclass and register for free. It's an 8 essential, it's got 8 lessons that are essential for teaching with comprehensible input, and will help you on your comprehensible input journey. So with that, if you don't have any questions, I thank all of you, and I will see you next week. Happy comprehensible input.